Thanks very much for being with us. IMF has, of course, taken the very coveted crown of the fastest growing economy from India and given it to China. There's a lot of disappointment there, but I want to ask you a very pragmatic question, all jokes set aside. 7.6% to 6.6%. What has been the basis of this growth rate cut?
First, it's a pleasure to be with you. We've lowered the growth forecast after the recent step that was taken to bring about the demonetization. And it's out of recognition that the very tight liquidity circumstances and cash shortages that followed seem to be having an effect on people's ability to spend. But I should say, the growth rate that India is going to have is still a very high growth rate, and I'm sure that we certainly think that the government should take whatever steps it can to provide the cash and the liquidity to reverse this event, and that once that's done, that the underlying strengths of the Indian economy will carry it forward.
You've chosen to call this temporary negative consumption shock. That's I'm quoting out of IMF. When do you see that shock disappear and normalcy return? And my other question is, if it wasn't for demonetization, would you have maintained 7.6% as the target? Because you've also cut the target for the next fiscal by 0.4 of a percentage point.
No, it pretty much comes from our assessment of this shock. There may have been some other reasons for small changes. As I say, it is important that the liquidity problem and the cash shortage problem is dealt with. It can be done by providing the new bills and finding ways to make sure that those who haven't been banked can become banked. The objective of this project was, of course, to cut down on the illicit use of cash and to bring informal parts of the economy in. Those could well be strengths in the future. And as I say, the government needs to take an effort to try to overcome this consumption shock, but it is a one-time shock.
Indeed it is. You know, IMF, when it sees and maps economies all across the world, you do look at fiscal results and fiscal policy very categorically. All over the world, we are seeing monetary policy take a back seat and fiscal policy take center stage in that sense, whether it's Mr. Trump or whether it's Mr. Modi. Would your barometer for fiscal deficit then be right for an economy like India? Because if India wasn't to meet its fiscal deficit, I'm sure it's going to fail on one of the counts that IMF measures performance on. But is that right to then measure a developing economy like India on that?
Well, we try to make a recommendation on fiscal policy that suits a country's circumstances. There are other countries, not India, other countries where there's slack in the economy and a need to have a more stimulative fiscal policy. In India's case, taking into account its macroeconomics, its budget, and its debt situation, we think that continued attention to controlling the budget deficit makes a lot of sense. India's growth is going to be determined ultimately by boosting productivity, bringing people into the formal economy, and finding ways for them to be productive. And it's not something to be tinkered with, I think, with fiscal policy. More importantly,
right.
Fiscal policy needs to be maintained in a way that ensures the stability of the economy.
India's debt to GDP ratio is still low, and so I'm going to ask you that question again. Is it then fair for India to stick to the fiscal deficit to the last decimal point to meet the expectations of ratings agencies and organizations like yourself? That's question number one. And question number two also has to do with the fact that, okay, let's just get fiscal deficit out of the way first.
Well, as I say, I think that the strength of the Indian economy is going to come from having productive activities for the many citizens, and that's what's going to boost GDP per capita growth. There is always some room, if needed, for fiscal policy, but right now we think that keeping the budget under control is probably the best policy.
One last question on India before I really move on to the more relevant parts about the United States and the world under Donald Trump. And that question has to do a lot with India's inherent levers for growth. You were IMF was very bullish on reforms. Has that pace slowed down, and is that a cause of concern for India's growth rate?
Well, I think reform has been good for India and can still be good. I think implementation of the GST is important. There are steps that are being worked on to improve the energy system of the country. There are a range of reforms and structural adjustments that I think can strengthen India and build a foundation for the growth in productivity and in inclusivity to be a strength for the country.
Just a question on our neighbours, China. You've increased its GDP growth forecast because obviously you believe that there are levers of growth there. But many people believe that the debt levels that exist in China could ruin the next bull run, could perhaps be a party pooper as far as the EM basket is concerned. Is that a cause of concern?
We have raised our growth forecast in the short run because the government seems clearly intent on using its levers of policy to achieve its target. But we are very concerned that there could be problems in the long run if they're not able to control the rising debt of their corporate sector and to make sure that there's some disciplines on state enterprises in terms of the amount of credit that they take on. So we see there's a need in the longer term to worry less about the growth rate and more about rebalancing the economy, building an economy that's based on household incomes, household spending, rather than exports.
Let's turn focus and talk about the one economy that everybody seems to be fixated with, and that's the U.S. economy. And there are two mixed signals coming from there. The first is that under President-elect Donald Trump, U.S. will perhaps see far higher rates of growth. And the other concern is that U.S. may perhaps turn very inward-looking, give up trade relations with things around the world. How is IMF assessing the growth landscape in the United States?
We're not really ready to assess in detail what the incoming administration is going to do because they're not in yet, and I think not only have they not begun to enact policies, I think they still haven't decided exactly what their policies are going to be. We have raised our growth forecast a bit because of what they have said, which is that there'll be likely some reduction in taxes, some infrastructure support, and some spending. So we see a modest stimulus coming from that. But there are many other policies: deregulation, infrastructure, new energy policies, as you mentioned, perhaps trade policies that are more conflictual than in the past. And we'll have to wait and see whether there are arguments about adopting those policies in the United States Congress and some uncertainty that comes from that, and then what policies are actually adopted, and then we'll make a reevaluation.
So no immediate gauge, but a positive stance there. There is a point of view that's emerging in the world about the IMF, and many people believe that multilateral forums like a G20 or a BRICS may actually be dwarfed under the presidency of Donald Trump. What sort of a role will IMF play to keep these multilateral forums relevant?
We think it's really important that globalization of trade and the interconnectedness between economies is maintained. That was the reason we were set up. Countries like your own, but the rest of the emerging market and developing world, needs to grow very rapidly for a long time if living standards are going to rise and converge with advanced economy living standards. To do that, you need trade, you need imports and exports, you need to import technology, managerial know-how, and have people invest in your country. So we feel that on behalf of our many members, we have 190 member countries, it's important for us to try to convene our membership to get them to cooperate in that direction. We'll have to wait and see what position, what approach the new administration favors. But we certainly believe that the benefits of globalization are substantial. We understand at the same time that not just in the U.S., but also in Europe, there's a lot of discontent about the negative side effects of globalization, and we're willing to work together to try to find ways to deal with those negative side effects in order to maintain support for this globalization that's really very necessary.
Our last question to you before you go. Is the IMF concerned about trade barriers across the world going up? If US were to become and disengage with its trading partners all across the world, there could perhaps be retaliatory action that may follow. Do you believe the world is going to be increasingly inward looking, and is the IMF concerned about that?
Well, we think that it's best to maintain interconnectedness. We understand that the incoming administration feels that some countries' policies have been disadvantageous advantageous to the United States, and they want to address that. I was struck by the metaphor that President Xi Jinping used yesterday, and he said that if you are protectionist, it's like going into a dark windowless room. Yes, it protects you from rain and wind, but it also keeps out light and air.
Yeah, that's true. And he almost delivered that message for Donald Trump. But on that note, thanks very much for speaking to us. I do have a question to ask on you on the IMF's own reforms. And many people believe that the developing economies and the emerging markets will perhaps get a greater representation. Is some of that on the back burner right now?
No, we're in that process. The last reform that was just approved not too long ago has begun to give greater weight to the fast-growing emerging market and developing countries. I think that's a process that is sure to continue.
Without undermining the authority of everybody who's doing a fantastic job at IMF, so will we see in the short term or a medium term an IMF chief from the developing markets?
We'll have to wait and see.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaking to us. Pleasure.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.